Let's get into it. We talk endlessly about boomers, millennials, and Gen Z. We analyze their habits, their memes, their whole impact on the world. But there's this entire generation that just gets skipped over, kind of like the middle child in the story of history. So today, we're going to uncover the unique psychology of that invisible generation, Generation X. Really think about it. When was the last time you saw a big trend piece or a news segment all about them? It's like they exist in this cultural blind spot, right between two massive, really loud generations. So, who exactly are we missing in this big generational picture? Well, meet Generation X. These are the people born roughly between 1965 and 1980. The teens of the 80s and 90s, the ones who actually built a lot of the early internet, but, don't feel the need to post their breakfast on it. And to really understand them, you have to go right back to the beginning, back to their childhood. And the first clue to their whole psychology is a really powerful one. See, it wasn't about what they had growing up, but what they didn't have. Adult supervision. They were literally forged in an empty house. This is absolutely crucial. Gen X were the original latchkey kids. Divorce rates were rising, more moms were entering the workforce, and suddenly millions of kids were coming home from school, letting themselves in with that key on a string around their neck, and they were just on their own for hours. No smartphones, no way to check in. It was just them and an empty house. And we're not talking about a small trend here. By 1984, there were an estimated 7 million kids between 5 and 13 who were regularly unsupervised after school. That's not just a statistic, that's a massive social experiment that shaped an entire generation's way of seeing the world. So, this whole experience created a really distinct psychological blueprint. It all started with that unsupervised childhood, right? Which forced them to learn this radical kind of self reliance. If you were hungry, you figured out how to make a snack. If you got into some trouble, you had to figure out how to get out of it. But most importantly, you learned that your actions had very real, very immediate consequences. Psychologists actually have a name for this kind of upbringing. They call it a high contingency environment. Basically, there was no one there to soften the blow. If you broke a dish, you had to deal with the fallout. Your brain became wired to constantly calculate risk and predict what would happen next, to think 3 steps ahead, simply because you had to. A skill that would later define how they built businesses and navigated their careers. But that self-reliance, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was paired with something else they learned from watching the world around them. A deep, and I mean deep, armor of skepticism. So here's the thing. You have to look at the massive gap between what Gen X was told and what they actually saw. They were promised stability, but they watched divorce rates just soar. They were told, be loyal to your company for life, but then saw their own parents get hit with round after round of corporate layoffs. The message was always follow the rules, but then right in front of them, the rules just changed. And believe me, this wasn't a one-time thing. Their entire economic lives have been bookended by disaster. They graduated college right into the recession of the early 90s. Just as they were hitting their professional stride, bam, the dot-com bubble burst in 2001. And then, just as they were building serious wealth, the 2008 financial crisis wiped a lot of it away. Every single event just hammered home that core lesson from childhood. The only person you can truly 100% count on is yourself. This kind of repeated trauma, well, it creates a very specific outlook. Psychologists call it defensive pessimism. It's the habit of expecting things to go wrong as a way to protect yourself from being disappointed. But here's the funny thing. If you ask a Gen Xer, they wouldn't call it pessimism. They'd just call it being realistic. And this realism, it totally extends to how they see public life, especially social media. They grew up in an analog world, a world where your mistakes were known by maybe a handful of people. And then they were forgotten. There were no viral videos. They learned a lesson early on that feels almost alien today. Being less visible meant you were safer. The whole idea of broadcasting your entire life just feels less like fun and a lot more like a risk. So, all of these experiences, the empty house, the broken promises, they all came together to create this fascinating set of contradictions that lie right at the heart of the Gen X personality. This is what we call the Gen X paradox.
And this first one just illustrates it perfectly. On one hand, they are fiercely, almost stubbornly independent. A Gen Xer will almost never ask for help. They've been figuring stuff out on their own since they were 8. But if you need help, they will be the first one to show up. No questions asked, zero drama, and they are definitely not going to make a social media post about it.
Okay, here's the second paradox, and it's a big one. They have this deep-seated distrust of authority. You have to remember, they grew up watching leaders fail them, from Watergate to the AIDS crisis, so a fancy title means absolutely nothing to them. But, and this is so key, they have an immense respect for competence. If you actually know what you're doing and have the skills to prove it, they will follow you anywhere. This all feeds into a work ethic that's just uniquely pragmatic. For Gen X, competence is everything. Their loyalty isn't to some company. They saw how that story ended for their parents. It's to their own skills. They know they can't control layoffs, but they can control being the most valuable person in the room. They value having multiple income streams because they learn the hard way that nothing lasts forever. They're just focused on getting the job done, period. So why does any of this matter? Why is it so important to understand this overlooked generation right now? Because they play this crucial yet often invisible role in our society. They are the bridge. And that is the fundamental truth right there. They are the very last generation that has a living memory of what the world was like before it was permanently online. They lived in both worlds, the analog and the digital. They remember boredom. They remember what it was like to just be alone with your own thoughts, to live a life that wasn't constantly being curated for an audience. And because of that, they developed a completely different set of problem-solving skills. Before, you could just Google everything. If your bike chain broke, you couldn't pull up a YouTube tutorial. You flipped the bike over, you got grease on your hands, and you just figured it out. This built a kind of practical, almost mechanical intuition that is just fundamentally different from a digital native mindset. And that really brings us to the most perfect metaphor for them. They are the bridge generation. They connect the old analog world of the boomers to the new digital world of millennials and Gen Z. And you know what? Just like a real bridge, they don't get much attention. They're just there, quietly doing the essential work of holding everything together. So I'll leave you with this question. We rely on their stability, their competence, their quiet pragmatism every single day. But what happens when we take them for granted? What do we lose as a culture, as a society, when a bridge becomes completely invisible?